The advent of the computer led early researchers to believe that they could easily design a machine that thinks and learns like a human. But early attempts to produce a thinking machine ran into some surprising problems. A computer connected to a robotic arm was told to stack blocks, but it started from the top rather than the bottom, dropping blocks into a pile. It didn't know about gravity. It turns out that thinking requires a lot of background information that we don't even see. Attempts to add learning ran into similar problems. The military tried to train a computer to spot tanks in the woods. The computer was first shown pictures of foliage with tanks and then foliage without tanks. It got to the point where it could distinguish them well in the training group, but when given a new set of photos, it flopped completely. It turns out that the photos with tanks were shot on a sunny day, while those without tanks were shot on a cloudy day, and the computer simply learned to distinguish between the relative brightness of the photos. These failures led scientists to believe that building a thinking machine required understanding how the brain works. They didn't initially worry about understanding the brain because they likened the problem to early flight. Early attempts to fly by mimicking how birds flap their wings were a disaster. We eventually bypassed biology to build fixed-wing aircraft. Scientists reasoned that by the same token, we could bypass the workings of the brain to develop a learning machine using an ordinary computer. But now scientists believe that understanding thinking and learning requires understanding how the brain itself works. And so we're going to use this as our point of departure into the question of how people learn. To understand how the brain works, it's important to understand that it's designed in a fundamentally different way from a traditional computer. A computer has two basic parts: the part that thinks, which is the central processing unit, and the part that stores memory, which is the RAM and hard drive. But the brain does not make this distinction between thinking and memory. Both thinking and remembering in the brain is done within the same neural network. The brain is composed of around 100 billion neurons connected to one another by about 1 trillion axons. Thinking occurs when a group of neurons fire in sequence. Signals come into a neuron from other neurons, which triggers that neuron to fire its own signal along its outgoing axon. This axon can branch off into thousands of axons to send signals to other neurons. This is a neural network. It's as if the brain were made up of billions of computers connected to one another. The process of neurons firing constitutes thinking, but it also strengthens the connections between those neurons, and this constitutes memory. Information is stored in the brain as a pattern of neural connections. When I think of my phone number, I fire millions of neurons in my brain in a pattern that produces that number. This act strengthens the connections between those neurons, which makes it easier for me to activate the same pattern later on, and this is memory. In this way, the brain is sometimes called a connectionist network, and the method of learning is sometimes called connectionism. There are, however, two types of memory: working memory, which is sometimes called short-term memory, and long-term memory. As the name suggests, working memory is used to perform immediate functions, like dialing a phone number, while long-term memory is information stored for future use. Learning, then, requires moving information from your working memory to your long-term memory. This is important because it brings up a common mistake that students make when studying. They might read a passage and know what it means at the time when they read it. This leads them to think that they have it in their mind ready for an exam. But that only shows that the information is in their working memory. The real test is being able to draw up the information at some future date from their long-term memory. A second important point is that our working memory can only hold up to 4 discrete chunks of information. If we try to add another chunk of information to the working memory, then one of the other chunks needs to fall out. Thus, we can easily overload our working memory to the point where information gets lost. As we learn, then, we're going to have to manage the amount of information that's in our working memory. Now it's time to work on our own memory. Please pause the video and answer the questions in your worksheet that are related to what we just covered. Once you're done, start the video again to learn about the implications of the brain structure for learning. One implication of how the brain works is that we need to periodically stop to reflect on what we're doing in order to develop long-term memories. It's not a good idea to read a long article from start to finish without pause, or to watch a long video without stopping for reflection. Either of these will likely lead you to forget much of what you just read or watched because you're trying to cram too many things into your working memory. A better strategy is to periodically stop to reflect on what you've learned. This could be taking notes on it, and by the way, it turns out that taking notes by hand gives them more permanence than typing. Something about the kinetic movement of the hand helps hardwire the thoughts into your long-term memory. Studies have shown that you need to revisit information a number of times to harden it in your long-term memory. Unlike a computer hard drive, which can acquire millions of bits of information and have it for good, the brain needs to build connections to store information. This is not an immediate process. It's done over time by repeatedly activating the neural patterns that constitute that information. Thus, repetition is key to learning and memory. It also turns out that you're going to learn better by spacing out your practice sessions over time. My repeating a phone number 10 times in a row is not as effective a method of my learning it as revisiting it once a day for 10 consecutive days. Repeating the same information over and over merely reinforces it in your working memory. You need to draw it from your long-term memory to activate the neural connections that will harden it within that memory. This is done by revisiting the information over a course of time. Another important principle is that thinking changes memory. It's been well established that eyewitness accounts are not nearly as reliable as people think. Tests have shown that people will vastly misremember events because their memory of those events is influenced by how they think about them. If you hold a prejudicial view towards a group, you are more likely to remember the assailant as a member of that group. You're not lying, your memory has literally been transformed by your thinking. Similarly, how students remember a reading or feedback from their instructor is heavily influenced by how they think about it. This can account for some of the situations in which students do not implement the feedback that they're given. They may think they're implementing it, but may have quite literally misremembered it. Finally, learning has a property that we learn on the periphery of what we already know by connecting new information with prior knowledge. A child who is learning to stack blocks is connecting new knowledge of how objects balance with old knowledge of gravity. This also means that we can better learn information by connecting it to metaphors of something that we can easily picture. The mathematician Khalid Azad helped himself understand imaginary numbers by likening them to a second vertical axis on the number line. He then likened the result to a clock. Every new power of an imaginary number constituted a hand of the clock moving 90 degrees. This accurately represented to him how the powers of imaginary numbers move from positive to imaginary to negative imaginary as you move ahead. That made it easy for him to understand the relationship between imaginary and real numbers. Thus, metaphors are a powerful way to teach and learn. Now it's time to reflect on what we've covered in this second part of the video. Please fill out the field on your worksheet related to the topics we just covered, and then move on to the error activities within this module. But before you go, we're going to end with a photo taken from a Chinese high school of students studying for an exam with an intravenous drip in their arms. Apparently, the Chinese government is funding the intravenous drips to improve student performance. Note that this is a study strategy that the Faculty Resource Center does not currently endorse. Thank you for spending some time with us learning about learning.